Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
We conclude this course with Titus and the two letters to Timothy, which we often refer to as the pastoral letters. And so before we jump into those three letters, simply a brief introduction on what it means to call these last three letters, Titus, 1 Timothy, and 2 Timothy, the pastoral letters. They've been called the pastoral letters since the 18th century, which we know as the 1700s. And the concern of these three letters is not so much the missionary expansion of the church. St. Paul is writing all of these letters because he's traveling to all these places and the church is expanding. The concern of these three letters is not so much the missionary outreach and the expansion of the church, so much as the care of those communities now that they've been evangelized, and now that the people who evangelized them are no longer there, either because they moved on or because they've died. So now what advice are we going to give these communities that are more established? We call them the pastoral letters. We see in there the root pastor. Pastor in Spanish. What's a pastor in Spanish? A shepherd. And so it gives us this image of how it is that we talk about pastoral ministry, for instance. Pastoral ministry is all about us being like shepherds, taking care of one another, taking care of others in the same way that a shepherd cares for his or her sheep. And so this word pastoral, when we hear of the pastoral letters, refers to pastors. And a great deal of both Titus and the first letter of Timothy deals with church structures. And today we know of pastors. Who is a pastor in a church? In Christian churches, the pastor is the head of a local church. So a pastor is the head of a local congregation. For instance, el pastor in a Baptist congregation, the Lutherans, other non-Catholic congregations often use the word pastor to be speaking of the title of that person. And even in the Catholic Church, the American Catholic Church, the Roman Church, and various manifestations of the Catholic Church, we talk about pastors as well. The pastor comes from that root, pastor, which is the shepherd of the flock. And so since these letters deal with church structure, how interesting that that word pastoral letters also may have its root in the structures that are being outlined there. So there are different images that we have from the New Testament. The image that we had for missionaries was that of a fisherman. How it was that Jesus told his disciples, you will be fishers of men, of people. You'll be in the same way that fishing, people who go out to fish, they throw out their nets and they bring in the fish. You as missionaries are going to go out and share the Word of God and draw all these people into the church. So fishing was the ancient metaphor, the New Testament metaphor for missionaries and for evangelizing, going out, like throwing the net and bringing all these people closer to Christ. And then the image of the shepherd was the New Testament image for actually, once they've been brought in, how it is that we care for them in the same way that the shepherd cares for the sheep. So the shepherd doesn't go out looking for sheep all over the world. The shepherd just takes care of those sheep that are under his or her care. So what's the relationship of Titus and Timothy, the two letters to Timothy? The three are very similar, or homogeneous if you prefer, in style and in atmosphere, so they're very similar to one another. So it could be the case that one person wrote all three, or it could be the case that someone simply took pains to mimic the style of another person. So do we know whether they're written by the same person or not? We don't. So all we have is what's found in those letters that give us no indication as to who wrote them. Of course, they were written in the name of Paul. So for years we've called it the letter of St. Paul to Titus, or the first letter of St. Paul to Timothy. Do we still believe that Paul wrote those letters? We don't, which is why we consider it part of the Deutero-Pauline letters. It was written by someone else. It's a pseudonymous letter. We don't know who wrote it, but it's been attributed to Paul all these centuries. Both Titus and 1 Timothy are more similar in style, and it's almost like a church manual, if you will. How it is that it warns against false prophets and teachers, It gives a great explanation of the order and the structures that the church should possess. It's almost like a manual, if you will. 2 Timothy doesn't deal at all with church order, and so it's for that reason that scholars often treat 2 Timothy differently or separately from Titus and the first letter to Timothy. Why do we order them? First of all, why are we ordering them in this way for this course? And what order are they in the Bible? In this course, we're going to talk about Titus first, and then the second letter of Timothy. In what order are they in the Bible? In the Bible, it's 1 Timothy, then 2 Timothy, and then Titus. And why are they that order in the Bible? It's simply going from the longest letter, 1 Timothy, to the next longest, 2 Timothy, to the shortest, which is Titus. That's the only reason they are in the order in which they are in the Bible. Why do we treat them in this order? Simply because, as we're going to find, 2 Timothy is sort of Paul's last farewell, a testament, a last will, if you will. It's sort of one of his farewell discourses, so we save that for the very end, only because it seems that Titus and Timothy would have been written, it seems, before 2 Timothy. So even though it's in the Bible, even though Titus is in the Bible after 2 Timothy, we're going to take that first because it seems that would have been written, if it were written by Paul, it would have been written before 2 Timothy. A bit of background on the letter to Titus. So who is Titus? Where do we find Titus in the Acts of the Apostles? We don't find Titus in the Acts of the Apostles. So St. Luke, in his second book, his first book was the Gospel of Luke. The second book was the Acts of the Apostles. Where does he talk about Titus? He talks about lots of people traveling around with St. Paul. Never mentions Titus, which is interesting because what's going to happen is we're going to date Titus to a second career of Paul. For those who believe that Paul wrote Titus, they gave Paul a second career, if you will. We think that Paul died somewhere between 63 and 67 AD. So Paul was in prison from 61 to 63. If he died in 63, then he's gone. But what happened, we talked about this before when we talked about him going to Spain. Is it possible that he got out of prison? If he was in prison from 61 to 63, is it possible that he was out of prison and then did something between, say, 63 and 67? Because what we have in the book of Titus and in the first and second book of Timothy is this second career, if you will. It's presuming that Paul got out of prison in 63 and now continued his travels. Not to Spain, but instead, for instance, Titus suggests travels to Crete in Greece. So from Rome, going back to Crete. So with Titus is not mentioned at all in the Acts of the Apostles. In the Acts of the Apostles, Paul gets to Rome, and we don't hear anything else about Paul. According to the tradition of the early church, Paul was martyred or killed in Rome, but the Acts of the Apostles leaves off with Paul in Rome, in prison.
So if he was killed in Rome, and he had gone like either 61 to 63 or a little after that, then the 63 to 67 that were written then, it wasn't by Paul, right?
Exactly. So, if Paul died in 63, and we don't know whether he died or not. If he died in 63, then obviously someone else wrote it. And even if he did live and have the second career, it still seems like someone else wrote it. So it's probably the case that it was simply written later, but then backdated, if you will, so as to sort of fit this time frame. And we'll talk a little bit later about why it is that an author might have done that. Why would you backdate a letter to a certain community and write that letter in Paul's name? Like stepping back in time. What, 30 years? Right? Let's write this letter as if Paul wrote it to them 30 years ago. So that when it's read, so that when it's discovered by people and read and shared in churches, they can see this was a letter that Paul wrote to Titus before he died. Oh. So according to the book of Titus, though, Paul's letter to Titus, what we have in chapter 1, verse 4 is how it is that Paul refers to Titus as my true son in the common faith. What do we know from other letters? When Paul talks about someone as a son or a daughter in the faith, it typically means that he converted them and brought them into the church. Galatians suggests that Paul brought Titus to the Jerusalem meeting. Let's take a look at Galatians briefly, just to see what the Galatians does say. Chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, Paul is writing. We know that Galatians was written by Paul. That's one of the undisputed letters. So Paul actually mentions Titus, even though the Acts of the Apostles does not mention Titus. In one of Paul's letters he does. So here we have in Galatians chapter 2, he talks about, in chapter 2, verse 1, then after 14 years I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took who? Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation, and meeting privately with those esteemed as leaders, I presented to them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. I wanted to be sure I was not running and had not been running my race in vain. And then Titus is mentioned again in verse 3. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. It gives us some insight from St. Paul about who Titus was. According to St. Paul, Titus was a Greek, so he was an uncircumcised Gentile. He was a non-Jew. He was a Greek. Was he circumcised? No. When we came to Macedonia, we had no rest, but we were harassed at every turn. Conflicts on the outside, fears within. But God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus. And so we have in St. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians again, another mention of Titus. And not only by his coming, but also by the comfort you had given us. He told us about your longing for me. How it was that the Corinthians longed for Paul. Your deep sorrow, your ardent concern for me, so that my joy was greater than ever. So the image that we have here was how it was that Titus carried this letter that was written by Paul with many tears to the Corinthians and brought about reconciliation, brought the people together, and brought Paul the good news in Macedonia later of how it was that this tearful letter helped to bring the community together. And then we find another mention in the second book of the second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 8, verse 6. So there are other mentions of how it was that Titus was later sent to Corinth to gather the collection that Paul was planning to take to Jerusalem. So Paul talks in his letter to the Corinthians about how he's going to take a collection to Jerusalem, and it was Titus who was later sent to gather that collection for the people of Jerusalem. So those are instances that we have from the actual letters of Paul that speak about Titus. Now, what we see is in letter D is that the letter to Titus, though, assumes this time, though, in which Paul is in Crete. Have we heard of Paul being in Crete before? No. So only in the letter to Titus do we hear of Paul being in Crete, in present-day Greece. And so it seems that the letter to Titus leads us to believe then that Paul left Titus there in Crete to correct anything that was wrong, that was defective, and to appoint presbyters or elders to lead the church in Crete. And so Paul's letter to Titus is going to outline what Titus should be looking for in presbyters, in these elders, in what we might call bishops, in the overseers today. How it is that the different qualities that we should look for in these people. I'm leaving you behind so that you can help to appoint these presbyters and to bring, to help bring the structures to this church community. And so presumably then, this letter was written when Paul left Crete, but the Acts of the Apostles, again, gives no indication that Paul was in Crete. So it almost presumes this time in which Paul got out of prison, went to Greece, and then somehow was later imprisoned again, or however it was that he befell his fate. The letter doesn't tell us where it's written from, but it's possible that it was written from Greece or Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, because we know that according to chapter 3, verse 12, Paul talks about his plan to winter in Nicopolis. Chapter 3, verse 12, Paul says, "As soon as I send Artemis or Tychicus to you, do your best to come to me at Nicopolis, because I have decided to winter there." So it gives the impression that Paul has gone on from Crete. Paul is no longer in Crete, but that he plans to go to Nicopolis for the winter. Did Paul ever do that? We'll never know.
It's a snowbird.
We'll never know whether Paul wintered there. All we have is this letter to Titus, which gives us information that's not found in any of Paul's letters, and it's not found in the Acts of the Apostles. It's new information for those of us who've been studying St. Paul. We just mentioned the names of Artemis and Tychicus. There are actually 4 people who are mentioned in this letter to Titus, 2 of whom are otherwise unknown. So we're talking about Artemis and Tychicus. Tychicus we've heard of before, but Artemis and also Zenas in this letter in verse 13 of that same chapter. So chapter 3, verse 12 speaks of Artemis, and verse 13 speaks of Zenas, the lawyer. We have no idea who Artemis and Zenas were, because the only mentions that we have of them in the Bible are right here. But the others that we have here, Tychicus, for instance, Tychicus was from Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, let's say. He was with Paul. He was said in Acts chapter 20 to have accompanied Paul as Paul left Corinth on his way to Jerusalem. So when Paul left Corinth in Greece to go back down to Jerusalem, it was said that Tychicus was with him, that they passed through Macedonia and Troas together. And he's mentioned as the conveyor of both Colossians and Ephesians, as the one who shared Paul's letter to the Colossians and Paul's letter to the Ephesians with those 2 communities. Apollos, according to this letter, it says there in verse 13, "Do everything you can to help Zenas the lawyer and Apollos on their way, and see that they have everything they need." So it gives them it gives us the impression that Apollos and Zenas were going to be passing through Crete and were to be sent off with everything that they needed for their journey. So Apollos is going to be passing through Crete and was last heard of at Ephesus when Paul sent. The last time that we heard of Apollos before this mention was when Paul sent him off at Ephesus in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. All of this to say, where is it being written from? We don't know. We're imagining from somewhere either in Greece or Macedonia or Asia Minor, somewhere in that region. And we're imagining that it's written to the community in Ephesus where Titus now finds himself. So we had one letter already written to the Ephesians. Now we're going to have this other letter written to Titus, who is going to be the head of the church of Ephesus. The book of Titus gives us an extended opening formula in chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. The only letter that has a longer opening formula than the letter to Titus is Paul's letter to the Romans. So we know that Paul wrote the letter to the Romans, long introduction if we remember back to the letter to the Romans. And Titus has the second longest introductory or opening formula. The question might be raised then, did Paul really need to introduce himself like he does here to a disciple that he's known for years? If Titus was traveling with Paul for so many years, would Paul have to speak of him in this way? Most scholars tend to believe that no, Paul wouldn't have to write of him this way. But then on the other hand, scholars know that Paul was writing his letters knowing that they were going to be shared with the community. And so maybe it's the case that the person who wrote this letter was writing it more with the community in mind, knowing that this letter was going to be read aloud in the churches where it was found. The main concern of this letter, though, is the preservation of the faith in Crete. So Paul is simply insisting on how it is that one of the duties of being an apostle, of one who is sent out, is to be concerned with the faith of God's elect, of God's chosen people in the places where that faith is found. So the letter might be divided. The first theme that the letter of Titus comes to in chapter 1, verses 5 to 9, has to do with church structure and order. And that this church structure and order, as we've said, is the main issue of the pastoral letters. And so in Titus, we see the author talking about church order, and the same in the first letter to Timothy. So we see here in chapter 1, verses 5 to 9, the author says, "The reason I left you in Crete," so we have the impression that Titus is being left in Crete, "the reason I left you in Crete was that you might put in order what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town as I directed you." What are the requirements for an elder? He says, "An elder must be blameless, faithful to his wife, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. Since an overseer manages God's household, he must be blameless, not overbearing, not quick-tempered, not given to drunkenness, not violent, not pursuing dishonest gain. Rather, he must be hospitable, one who loves what is good, one who is self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firmly to the trustworthy message as it has been taught, so that he can encourage others by sound doctrine and refute those who oppress it." So what we have here is essentially the author's way of putting forth the qualities and or qualifications, the things that you should look for in the presbyters of the church. Presbyter, is that a word that we've heard before? A presbyter comes from a Greek word meaning elder. So the presbyters were the elders of the church. So how it is that the ones who lead the church, the presbyters, what it is that they should be like. What are the qualities that you should be looking for in the presbyters there for the communities in Crete? So during Paul's stay in Crete, Paul didn't establish a fixed structure for the church, but he's giving that task to Titus now. Now that Paul has moved on, he's asking Titus to take care of all the loose ends. He says, in order to do what was left unfinished, and to appoint elders or presbyters in every town. It's interesting because Titus only mentions the appointments of presbyters and bishops. So in the early church, what we're going to see in the first letter to Timothy, the structure that Timothy is going to talk about is going to be that of presbyters and overseers and of deacons. And so that's the structure that we'll see in 1 Timothy. In Titus, the only ones that we're going to see mentioned are overseers and presbyters. Sorry, deacons. No mention of deacons in 1 Timothy. In Titus, the mention of deacons will come in 1 Timothy. Of deacons and deaconesses, as we'll see. But in Titus, the structure that we see is going to be that of overseers or bishops, we might call them today, and presbyters.
Yo una pregunta.
Please.
¿Y por qué en la iglesia romana nunca se ha oído que haya mujeres en la religión de Corinto?
So the question is, why in the Roman Church why does the Roman Catholic Church never talk about deaconesses in Scripture? I can't speak for everyone in the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, in Scripture, we have those instances of deaconesses. And as we're going to see in the first letter to Timothy, we have the qualities that we should look for in deaconesses. But why it is that there would be a silence, I have a feeling it is to keep in place the structures that are currently in place. Paul had a vision of all of us being equal, a discipleship of equals. There is no male or female, but as we saw in Colossians and Ephesians, there is a different structure that's probably more aligned with the structure in the Roman Catholic Church. I'm imagining the Roman Catholic Church has more of this vision, women being submissive to men. Who controls all the leadership positions in the Roman Catholic Church? Men. It's a different vision from that which we see in Paul's letter. So it's a very different structure.
Y eso viene de por decir, de como las iglesias romanas, de que no se ha visto que se ordenen diáconos. Eso cuenta ya en Roma o qué sé yo, donde dan los permisos o...
Interesting question. So what's interesting is that Pope Francis now, so the question is, I mean, does any of this matter? That deaconesses are found in Scripture, or that a letter might talk about the qualities of deaconesses, does that matter to the Roman Catholic Church? What has happened is we've had this radical elected to the chair of St. Peter, who is now the Pope. We know him now as Pope Francis. And Pope Francis, on the survey that he sent out to all of the churches, to all the Roman Catholic churches throughout the world,
Bless you.
he had a question on there on the role of women in the church. So is it conceivable that a person like Francis, who seems to be cracking open the windows of the church a bit and letting in a bit of fresh air, is it conceivable that were he to live longer, that he could make changes to that effect? Certainly it is. It all depends on a person's attitude. Pope John Paul II in 1996 in an encyclical said, there will be no conversation about the ordination of women, period. There will be no conversation. And Bishop John McCarthy here in the Diocese of Austin, do we all know Bishop John McCarthy?
Sure.
A retired bishop. He loves telling the story of how it was that when John Paul II came to San Antonio, they had a big celebration. Well, before the celebration, all the bishops of Texas were sitting down to lunch with the Pope, and Bishop McCarthy, being a very forward-thinking bishop, said to the Pope over lunch, he said, you know, here in the United States, we're talking a lot about the possibility of women being ordained one day. And Bishop McCarthy loves telling a story of the Pope's response, which was, Bishop McCarthy is saying, you know, how it is that here in the United States we talk about this equality of men and women, how nice it would be if women one day would be ordained. And what does he say that John Paul II said to him in reply? He said, these are good potatoes.
Who's gonna make them? The food is good.
These are good potatoes. Meaning what? Meaning he was not going to talk about it. And in 1996, when he issued his encyclical, I mean, he made it clear that we are not to discuss the ordination of women in the Roman Catholic Church. Period. It is a non-issue. You will not discuss it. So
But
how
you know,
fascinating.
Sorry,
Go on, please.
but they are claiming that this Pope is looking to do a lot of changes, right? But by the looks of it, that he's going to do a lot of changes.
So it's conceivable that the present Pope, the present Bishop of Rome, we know him as Francis now, that Francis could, I mean, if he put on this survey to all Catholic churches throughout the world a question that has to do with women and their place in the church, it suggests that at least he's open to hearing perspectives throughout the world on the place of women in the church.
Well, like they claiming, he's doing a lot of things the other popes have not done. You know, where he's going to visit and where he has shared, it's just like the scripture that says there, you know, who's this Jesus that sits down with the Gentiles or wherever, you know, to eat or to share the meal, whatever, with them, or enters their home.
So the word that we often use of people like Pope Francis is that he is more pastoral. What does it mean to be pastoral? Remember, it goes back to that root again of how it is that a shepherd cares for the sheep. That Pope Francis, we will never forget that image when he was going in to be crowned or to be installed as Pope. How it was that he stopped the Pope mobile and got down and was among the people. He is more pastoral, the word we might use, than his predecessors, who seem, for instance, John Paul II. You know, would you use the word pastoral of a person who seeks to exclude half the church? Just a very different.
Yeah, but he's gotten off to shake people's hand in places where the other popes didn't do. Things that the other popes do, he's being kind of known to be doing or something. And that said there will be a change.
So we know that women were ordained in the Roman Catholic Church, in the Catholic Church for the first 600 years. So we have a history that may not be spoken about. The Pope may tell us that we can't talk about these things, but does that mean that we're not going to talk about it? You know how it is, right? So we continue to talk about these possibilities. In the American Catholic Church, it is a non-issue because we ordain both men and women. We open ministry to all. We don't see it as our job to be a closed gate saying, nope, you can't receive communion, or you can't receive ordination, or you can't.
But there was a ordination of women in the diaconal before what?
Correct. So even in Scripture, we have instances of deaconesses, and we talk about deaconesses and their qualifications. And so it is part of our tradition and part of our history.
What was that part you were reading a while ago? Was it in 1 Timothy, I believe, of the, where he mentions the deacon or something in there?
We're going to get to that when we get to the first letter of
Okay.
Timothy. Good question. So right now we're on Titus. Titus only mentions the overseers, which today we know as the bishops, and the presbyters, which today we know as the priests.
Right.
So deacons, priests, bishops. Back then, the words we used were deacons, presbyters, and overseers, or episcopoi. And so Titus is going to speak about the first two categories of overseers and presbyters. And then when we get to 1 Timothy, then we're going to see all three of them, which forms the basis, the scriptural basis, for the various ministries in the church today of deacons and presbyters and bishops. Okay. So now in the book of Titus, in those verses, verse 5 through 9, we talk about the various qualifications demanded of the people who are in these roles so as to protect the faith. Right? In order for us to protect the faith and keep handing on the faith, we've got to make sure that the people that we have in those ministries are good people. And isn't that what we do even today? At Deacon John's ordination, the Archbishop stood and asked if we believed, if I as pastor and if we as a community believe that Brother John was ready to be ordained a deacon and to be Deacon John. And so it's still this wanting to safeguard the faith. If we go off and ordain anyone, regardless of how long they've been in the church or what they believe and what they say, that's just setting us up for danger. And so it's good. We need to make sure that people have a proper formation, that they've had some relationship with the church, that it is over time, because otherwise the church is in danger. And that's the message that we get here in the letter to Titus. What are the things that we should look for in these persons who are leaders so as to be able to protect the faith? The second theme that we find in the letter to Titus has to do with false teaching, and that's in verses 10 to 16. It talks about these false teachers in a very polemical or in a very sparring or fighting way. But it's hard for us to know who is being referred to here, because all we have is the description that's given to us. It says, for instance, in verse 10, this is still Titus chapter 1, "For there are many rebellious people full of meaningless talk and deception, especially those of the circumcision group." Who are we talking about? Who's the circumcision group? The circumcision group, were they the Jews or the Gentiles? The Jews. The ones who were circumcised. "They must be silenced, because they are disrupting whole households by teaching things they ought not to teach, and that for the sake of dishonest gain." They're making money off teaching false things. "One of Crete's own prophets has said it. Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons. This saying is true." Ouch. "Therefore, rebuke these false teachers sharply so that they will be sound in the faith and will pay no attention to Jewish myths or to the merely human commands of those who reject the truth." So what was it that these people were teaching? We really don't get much of an indication here, except that we do see that they're talking down about the circumcision group, those who were formerly Jews, and they do mention Jewish myths, so it tends to suggest that these people were somehow, had some knowledge of things Jewish. So the Christians of Jewish ancestry come under fire there in verse 10, when he refers to them as the circumcision group. The implication is that they follow human rules, declaring things impure. In verse 15 we see that. "To the pure all things are pure, but to those who are corrupted and do not believe, nothing is pure." Remember the circumcision group? Those who believe that, you shouldn't eat pork, or shrimp, or lobster, or catfish, or pepperoni pizza, or cheeseburgers, anything that the Old Testament says you shouldn't eat, right? "To the pure, you Gentiles, all things are pure, but to those who are corrupted and do not believe," like the circumcision group, "nothing is pure. Their consciences are corrupted. They claim to know God, but by their actions they deny God. They claim to be saved by their circumcision and by their following of the law, not by their faith in Christ. That's what Paul would have said. And so it seems that there's this group who would have been more strictly interpreting the Jewish law, the Mosaic law, and it seems that we're talking about those people here in this paragraph. What they mean by Jewish myths is unclear to us. There in verse 14, all we have is what's written there, where it says they pay, and so that the people pay no attention to Jewish myths. What myths were being told them? We don't have any record of them. But there is in verse 16 where it says they claim to know God. There is some suggestion that there could have been some syncretism. You remember the word syncretism from last class? Syncretism is when it is that two faiths or two beliefs are mixed together. Like the example that we often use of syncretism here in the southern United States and in Mexico is that of Our Lady of Guadalupe. When you bring together the Aztec beliefs and the Aztec faith with the Catholic faith of Spain, what happened? We had this Aztec goddess Tonantzin, when the Catholic faith then became Our Lady of Guadalupe, a syncretism, bringing faiths and beliefs of two traditions together. So maybe there's a syncretism here in this letter to Titus between the Jews and Jewish beliefs, that of following the law, but also when it says that they claim to know God, there was also this belief in Gnosticism back then. Gnosticism was this belief in the late 1st century that one could have special knowledge of God. They were called the Gnostics. The Gnostics had special knowledge of God. So if Becky is a Gnostic, she walks into the room tonight and says, "Oh, I have good news. I spoke to God today. I received a message from God, and God said." Gnosticism, then, are these people who claim to have this special knowledge from God that none of the rest of us have. So Becky, being the Gnostic that she is, starts speaking to us, and so we're like, God hasn't talked to me in this special way, but Becky is claiming that she has this special knowledge that's from God. So in verse 16 when it says they claim to know God, it almost gives us the impression that this paragraph is speaking of this possible syncretism of the Jewish religion and of Gnosticism, these people who believed that they had this special knowledge of God. The Gnostics, they call themselves. And then there's a third part in this letter to Titus that deals with community relations and belief, which is chapters 2 and 3. And this takes up 2/3 of the book of Titus. The first section is on the household code here in Titus, so that's worth looking at since we're examining household codes here. Titus chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. But what's interesting is that it's not talking about husbands and wives, fathers and children, masters and slaves. Instead, it's talking about old people, yikes, and young people.
Okay. Oh.
So the question is rightly aged. What do we mean by old people or older people? In the ancient world, when you hit 60 years old, you were old.
What call?
You were old at 60.
I'm too glad I'm not 60.
Right? And so, for instance, this is chapter 2, verse 2. Teach the older men to be temperate, worthy of respect, self-controlled, and sound in faith and love and endurance. So these are the various virtues that we should make sure that our older men possess in the community. What about the older women? Those who reach 60 but are women. Likewise, teach the older women to be reverent in the way they live, not to be slanderers or addicted to much wine, but to teach what is good. Then they can urge the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure, to be busy at home, to be kind, to be subject to their husbands. Didn't we read that already? So that no one will malign the word of God.
I like it in Spanish, Padre. Que no sean chismosas.
Que no sean chismosas. So to be gossips or to be busybodies, right? But rather to be busy. We've heard those words before. And then young men, we're going to teach them in verse 6. Similarly, encourage the young men to be self-controlled. In everything, set them an example by doing what is good. Verse 9 talks about slaves. Teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything. So you can see why the Bible is sometimes criticized for upholding institutions like slavery. Verse 9, teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything. We've heard that before in Ephesians. To try to please them, not to talk back to them, and not to steal from them, but to show that they can be fully trusted, so that in every way they will make the teaching about God, our Savior, attractive. There's the household code that we find here in the book of Titus. The next section, which goes from chapter 2, verse 11 to chapter 3, verse 11, gives pastoral instructions based on what Christ has done. So the Cretans, because Christ has saved the Cretans, they shouldn't be foolish and disobedient slaves to passion, because Christ gave himself to redeem them and purify them. So Paul is going to talk about how it is, or the writer who writes in the name of Paul is going to talk about how it is that the Cretans should be models attracting others to the faith, which is what we find in verse 7. In everything, set them an example by doing what is good. Be models for others. And one of the ways that they're going to be models for others comes in chapter 3, verse 1, when the writer says, remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient. Because one of the ways they're going to be a model for all peoples is by being model citizens. So by obeying the authorities, then in verse 2, to slander no one, to be peaceful and considerate, and always to be gentle toward everyone. It's in those ways that you are going to be a model for other people. Chapter 3, verses 9 to 10 talk about how there's nothing more harmful than those foolish dissensions and quarrels that happen within the community. So verse 9, avoid foolish controversies and genealogies and arguments and quarrels about the law, because these are unprofitable and useless. Warn a divisive person once, and then warn them a second time. After that, have nothing to do with them. If someone's trying to create division in the community, warn them once, warn them twice, and after that, you don't even need to bother to waste your breath with them again. Don't have anything to do with them. You may be sure that such people are warped and sinful. They are self-condemned. They've condemned themselves by what it is that they're doing and saying. The role of the presbyter bishops in the pastoral letters. So we've talked a bit before how it is that the presbyters are the elders, and then the bishops, the word that we use often in Scripture is overseers, or the Greek word was in the singular it was episkopos, or the plural was episkopoi. So the epi means over, skopos to see, so the overseers of the community, the episkopos, the episkopoi, plural. That's where we get the root of words like bishop. Anything that relates to a bishop is episcopal. The bishop's ring is the episcopal ring. The bishop's mitre is the episcopal mitre. The episcopal seal. So anything that has to do with bishops is episcopal, comes from that root episkopos, which means an overseer. So in the letter to Titus, we see how it is that presbyters were appointed in each community. Do we see how it was that Paul told Titus, or the author writing the name of Paul told Titus, in every community appoint an elder, a presbyter. In the ancient world, we already talked about how it was that once you reached the age of 60, you were an elder. Younger people who were also noted for their good judgment could be elders. And so even if you hadn't yet reached the age of 60, but you showed some good judgment, some wisdom, if you will, wisdom beyond your years, then you could be considered an elder even before the age of 60. Good news. What did the presbyters do? They gave direction to the community and presided over the community. They also exercised this pastoral care, this being a shepherd for others. That was the role of the presbyter, was to be a good shepherd. And that's where we get the difference between, say, the presbyters and the deacons, because the deacons, as we're going to see in 1 Timothy, did more menial work, right? In the Acts of the Apostles, we talk about how it was that the deacons were, while the presbyters were engaged in prayer and pastoral ministry, the deacons were going to be the table waiters, making sure that the bodily needs of all were taken care of. So this here we have how it is that the presbyters were presiding over the community and exercising this pastoral or shepherding function within the community. The overseer was another title for a presbyter. So in some places these words are used almost interchangeably, but it's almost like overseeing becomes another function where one person in the community begins to oversee others. Sort of almost like the primus inter pares. In Titus, chapter 1, verses 5 to 6, what we're going to see is that the term episkopos is singular, so it talks about one overseer, but presbyteroi is plural, it talks about many elders, and so it gives us the impression of how it is that there's one overseer and various elders. So that, for instance, chapter 1, verses 5 to 6, the reason I left you in Crete was that you might put in order what was left unfinished and appoint elders, plural, as I directed you. An elder must be blameless, faithful to his wife, a man whose children believe, and not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. The next one, since an overseer, singular, manages God's household, he must be blameless. So we see how it is that just the words seem to imply that the elders, plural, suggest there are many elders or presbyters or priests, today would be the word, and that there's one overseer, singular in verse 7. The modern day equivalent, one bishop, various priests. But is there a hierarchy where the overseer is over the presbyters? The letter really doesn't talk about one being over the other, it just talks about different functions as we read there in verses 5 to 7. We also see the various qualities that are there for different functions, which we've outlined here as there are various negative descriptions or disqualifying behaviors. You know, if a person does these things, then they're excluded. So that, for instance, if you're arrogant or quick-tempered or violent or quarrelsome, or if you're a heavy drinker, if you're greedy for gain, if you're loving money, that excludes you from any of these offices. But there are also positive descriptions or desired virtues, you know, that you be faultless, above reproach, hospitable, gentle, loving, devout, just, showing good sense, self-controlled, sober, dignified. So there are negative descriptions that would disqualify you and positive attributes that we would look for. There are also certain life situations that we expect of these people in ministry. For instance, that they be married only once, with children who are believers and not recent converts or subordinate. Let's talk through all of those briefly, simply to see what that means, especially for us in the 21st century now. Married only once. Why would we say married only once? Because back then the belief was, what do we even say today? Till death do us part. Well, back then it was sort of like, okay, I commit myself to this other person. And so that, for instance, the widows, they were committed to their husbands throughout life, even if the husband died first. Sorry, you committed yourself to your husband for the rest of your life. Today, is that the same view that we have today? Even in Catholic churches, including the Roman Catholic Church, including the American Catholic Church, we recognize how it is that when those two people become one, but then in death, what happens? That union is dissolved by death. And so once a person's partner has passed, then that person is free to enter into marriage again. In the American Catholic Church, we go one step farther. In the Roman Catholic Church, we have the whole process of, what did we call it? Dissolution of marriage in the Roman Catholic Church was called annulments. The annulment of marriages. You know, in the American Catholic Church, we recognize that, you know, sometimes the most faithful response in a broken relationship is separating and getting on with your lives. If you've arrived to such a point in a relationship, and all of us who've been in a long-term relationship know the feeling, you've come to a certain point in a relationship where, you know, we've had our disagreements over time and have not been able to reconcile and get back together, and we've fallen out of love with one another. We've just arrived at this point in which, you know, separation is the most faithful option, and letting the other person go and become who he or she should be.
Father, is that right? I understood, maybe I'm too wrong, but that if he was like life-threatening in that marriage, or he had abused her,
Right.
either one of them abused, right? In other words, that then the annulment would be good to do that. But if it just because they wanted to separate for no good cause, and they wanted an annulment that a lot of times they would not consider it.
So the good news is that we don't even talk about annulments. We don't even talk about annulments, only because what happened was the Roman Catholic Church came up with this process to annul marriages. First of all, you have to be divorced civilly, so the marriage is already over. But what is an annulment? An annulment is an attempt by the Roman Church to prove that the marriage never validly happened. We have a problem with that. So let's think about that for a moment. So what that is it's trying to take a look back. Even though you've been married for 20 years, let's take a look back 20 years ago to see what reason it is that that marriage didn't really happen, that the marriage was not valid. Because if the marriage wasn't valid, even though you thought you've been living in marriage all these lives, it's an attempt to disprove that you were married all those years. Do you follow me?
Yeah, well, that's kind of said that this. A lot of people that they would ask for an annulment just because they wanted to get married through the church, with another second wife or whatever, and that's what the annulment was really to do that. Otherwise, you couldn't be married to the church because you had been married already once. Well, you had already gone to your second one.
That's the basis of the annulment was rooted in the belief that once you're married forever. And so once you're married, it's forever. So the question becomes, were you really married? Were you validly married? Because if you were validly married, you're married forever. So then the question becomes an attempt by lawyers, canon lawyers we call them, to show that you really weren't married. Even though you thought you were married for those 20 years, it's lawyers going through and finding legalistic ways to explain how it was that you really were not married all those years.
So the annulment would kind of mean like they would just erase everything.
That's right.
But it still would be in the books at the courthouse.
You're civilly divorced. The relationship is over.
Yeah, but I mean the marriage over. You
The
married.
marriage is over.
They put that and they write it down on the book there and it stays on the book. They don't go back and erase the book.
No. So in the American Catholic Church, we don't even waste time with annulment simply because we recognize if two people have civilly divorced, then that's their way of saying this relationship is over. Bless you both. What did you learn from that? Get on with your lives. Does that make sense? Rather than beating ourselves over, and rather than trying to prove through some process, which we might call an annulment, that marriage never existed, what good comes from that? To say that even though you thought that you were married for these 20 or 30 years, what good is it to go back to the time that you were getting together and married, to be able to prove that you weren't validly married? What good does that do to anyone? Oh, I have good news, you weren't validly married. What? You were married, it was valid, it was a sacrament,
I mean,
and it didn't work out.
You are married.
And it didn't work out.
So, are some annulments denied?
By the Roman Catholic Church?
Yes.
So in the American Catholic Church, we don't have the annulment
Right,
process.
right.
In the Roman Catholic Church, an annulment is denied if you can prove that it was valid. So they have to take a look at, okay, is there a reason? The annulment process is essentially finding a reason to prove that a marriage was not valid in the first place. I used to be good at this because when a person came to me wanting an annulment, then I would have to think, okay, I'd have to think through the law, the Roman Catholic canon law, and think through the loopholes and figure out, okay, on what grounds are we going to say this person wasn't validly married? Oh, spent years working in that. So that, for instance, if the person was not mature enough psychologically, emotionally, in whatever way, to be married at that time. If we can find a few witnesses who are willing to offer their testimony that, we love, we'll use someone who's not in the room here, Juan. We love Juan, but when he was married, he was not mature enough to enter into marriage. I know he was 27 years old, but, let's get a few witnesses who will be able to help corroborate the fact that Juan, when he was married, was not mature enough so that we can get his wife the annulment that she's seeking through the church. If he wasn't mature enough, then it was not a valid marriage. So it becomes this legalistic pursuit of trying to disprove that a sacrament took place. Because if the sacrament took place, if you are validly married, then you're married for life in the Roman Catholic Church.
So is that anywhere in the Bible? Or has that just trickled down?
Oh,
the annulment fact?
Oh, annulments, well, the annulments are based scripturally in that belief that when two people come together, you know, a husband leaves his wife and the two become one, the two have become one.
Okay.
And so if the two are one, now how do you
Separate.
separate them? No, you can't, because they become one. But the annulment process is an attempt to show that, you know what, it looked like they were one, but they weren't really one. They were not united in marriage. We all went to the wedding and it looked like they were married. Then they had kids together. They had 20 great years of marriage together and we thought that they were married. The annulment process is an attempt to prove that there was no sacrament of marriage that ever took place.
She was not submissive.
And so, fortunately for us in the American Catholic Church, we don't have to worry about these things. Right? Relationships are such that people fall in love with one another, people fall out of love with one another, people get along well together, people fight with one another, and at the end of it all, when they go down and file for a civil divorce and say, it is over, God bless you both, I am really sorry. Is there a more painful moment in a person's life than that? That is when we as a church need to be present ministering to those people rather than driving them away and telling them they can't come to communion or that they can't go to confession or whatever else it is that we've heard in the past. That's our opportunity to minister to people who are hurting. So we were describing then that was the only being married once. With children who are believers, because that reflects on you, right? Oh, look at you. You want to be the leader of our community, and your kids are not even believers, right? What does that say about a person? Not recent converts, because if you just only recently came to the faith, this is a challenge for any church community, right? Because what happens is people come to the faith and they're all excited and they burn with enthusiasm, and they say, I want to be ordained. So can you imagine what a challenge it would be if someone just came to the American Catholic Church today and told Archbishop Johnson, I have great news, I found you online and I want to be ordained. And can you imagine, okay, we give them all their theological studies in 3 months and then we ordain them? How dangerous is that? Doesn't it seem that there should be some long time journey here of the seed growing over time? It's the law of the harvest, right? The seed is something that we plant and just have to keep watering and it grows over time. And it's the same with faith, which is why with the ministers in this letter to Titus, we see how it is that they should not be recent converts. Why? Because then they have a long time understanding of their faith and a long time relationship with the community. And then there are finally skills related to the work to be done. You know, if you're going to be a pastor in the church, or the words we used back then were an elder or an overseer, what are some of the skills that would be helpful for overseers and or for elders? That they have a good reputation with outsiders, that they manage their own household well, that they be a good teacher, that they hold fast to the trustworthy word which accords to the teaching and sound doctrine. There are just different things which, if you want to be an elder in the church or an overseer, there are different skills that you might have. If you want to be an overseer in the church but you can't even manage your household, yikes. If you want to be an overseer or a presbyter, but you just don't have the skills to teach people the truth, yikes. Do you want elders or overseers who are teaching people false things? That's the letter to Titus then, this very short letter, purportedly written to Titus, purportedly during this time after which Paul traveled to Crete. If Paul ever did travel to Crete, it would have been after the imprisonment in Rome, Paul going to Crete, and then leaving Titus behind saying, these are the structures that I'd like for you to set up, the qualities to look for in the presbyters and the overseer, singular, in the communities there in Crete.
We are